By 1986, the Soviet Union had been fighting in Afghanistan for 6 years after invading in December 1979 to kill President Hafizullah Amin and install a Moscow-friendly government. Yet despite committing 120,000 troops, deploying modern weapons including helicopters and jet aircraft, and spending billions of rubles on military operations and economic aid, the Afghan Mujahideen rebels had not been defeated and controlled large parts of the mountainous countryside, while benefiting from unlimited financial support and weapons from the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China, who viewed the conflict as an opportunity to bleed the Soviet Union. The war had become a stalemate, where Soviet forces held cities and major roads through brutal search and destroy operations that caused massive civilian casualties, while insurgents ambushed convoys, attacked outposts, and melted back into villages or across the Pakistani border, where they received training, weapons, and sanctuary that made them impossible to eliminate through military force alone. Moscow wanted to end the war without suffering a humiliating defeat that would damage Soviet credibility in the Cold War. But the army's continuing operations achieved nothing except more death, while the fundamental problem remained unsolved: that most Afghans rejected the communist government and its Soviet protectors regardless of how many soldiers Moscow deployed or how much economic aid it provided to a regime that survived only through foreign military support and secret police repression. In February 1986, new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev made his intentions clear at a conference attended by Afghan communist leader Babrak Karmal, declaring that counter-revolution and imperialism had turned Afghanistan into a bleeding wound and that the USSR wanted to withdraw its troops in the nearest future while preserving Soviet security and avoiding the appearance of defeat. Gorbachev and Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze had adopted a new foreign policy known as New Thinking that prioritized ending unwinnable conflicts over maintaining communist control everywhere, recognizing that the Afghanistan war was draining resources desperately needed for domestic economic reforms and that continuing the fight indefinitely would accelerate the Soviet Union's decline. They decided Karmal was no longer the right man to lead the Afghan communist government, and in November 1986, Gorbachev forced him to resign in favor of Mohammad Najibullah, the ruthless head of the Afghan secret police who promised national reconciliation, greater role for Islam, and slower pace of the radical modernization that conservatives and Mujahideen opposed. Najibullah changed the country's name from Democratic Republic of Afghanistan to simply Republic of Afghanistan, promised more free enterprise and multi-party politics, and claimed the ruling People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan would slow reforms that had alienated traditional Afghan society. At the same time, though, Najibullah expanded the secret police apparatus, purged the party of Karmal's supporters and other opponents, and consolidated his grip on power through repression rather than the reconciliation he publicly promised. The new leader faced an impossible task as Moscow prepared to withdraw while expecting him to maintain communist control over a country where the government was supported by only a minority of the population and where Soviet military presence was the only thing preventing Mujahideen victory. As Moscow searched for a way out and Najibullah tightened his grip on power, the United States dramatically increased support for the Mujahideen, with funding growing from $450 million in 1986 to $630 million in 1987, sums matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia, making the covert CIA program one of the largest in American history. New weapons arrived, including the Stinger anti-aircraft missile, a shoulder-fired system that gave insurgent fighters the ability to shoot down Soviet helicopters and aircraft that had previously operated with near impunity across Afghan skies. President Reagan's administration had initially opposed sending such advanced technology to Afghanistan, fearing it might escalate the conflict or that the weapons could fall into the wrong hands. But supporters argued that Stingers would turn the tide of the war by neutralizing Soviet air superiority that had been decisive in countless battles. Mujahideen fighters began using Stingers in September 1986, forming hunter-killer teams that attacked aircraft during takeoff or landing and targeted helicopters arriving to support Soviet ground troops during ambushes, forcing dramatic changes in Soviet tactics almost immediately. Soviet pilots had to fly either very high to stay out of Stinger range or very low, hugging terrain to avoid giving insurgents time to lock onto their aircraft, both approaches reducing effectiveness of close air support that ground forces depended on during combat operations. Soviet journalist Alexander Prokhanov noted the psychological impact, observing that air crews used to be kings of Afghanistan with everyone saluting them. But after Stingers arrived, pilots took to flying very high with little value to ground troops who began sarcastically referring to them as cosmonauts floating uselessly in space rather than providing the air support that had previously given Soviet forces decisive advantages. There remains debate among historians about exactly how many aircraft Stingers destroyed, with some estimates suggesting hundreds, while others argue the numbers were lower, but the missiles definitely forced the Soviets to react by changing tactics, installing decoy flare systems on transport aircraft, and accepting that air superiority no longer guaranteed victory in a war where insurgents could now contest the skies using American technology. The Stingers demonstrated how external support from the United States and its allies could neutralize Soviet military advantages, providing Mujahideen fighters with capabilities they could never develop themselves, and ensuring that Moscow could not achieve military victory regardless of how many troops or weapons it committed to Afghanistan. In November 1987, the Soviets launched Operation Magistral, the biggest military operation of the entire 9-year war, committing approximately 24,000 Soviet and Afghan government troops to retake control of the road linking Kabul to Gardez and Host and lift the years-long siege of Host as a demonstration of strength before the planned withdrawal that Gorbachev had already decided upon. The operation targeted Mujahideen forces under experienced commander Jalaluddin Haqqani, whose men had mined the approaches, established defensive positions in mountain passes, and were equipped with rocket launchers and recoilless rifles provided by Pakistani intelligence and the CIA. Soviet forces began the assault by dropping parachute dummies to trick Mujahideen fighters into revealing their positions through premature firing, then launched a two-pronged attack with one column failing against strong resistance, while another surprised weaker tribal militia at the Satukandav Pass. The intensity of Soviet artillery bombardment was so great that chemical residue from explosions contaminated mountain streams, with one Mujahideen fighter later recalling that a single glass of water would choke you and make you very ill from the chemicals. Over the following weeks, Soviet and Afghan government forces made steady progress through brutal fighting, eventually relieving the besieged Afghan army garrison at Host in late December 1987 after months of combat that demonstrated Soviet ability to achieve tactical victories through overwhelming firepower. But in early January 1988, the Mujahideen struck back at overstretched Soviet positions along the road, targeting the 9th Company of the 345th Parachute Regiment that had been deployed to guard the main highway near Satukandav. The Soviet paratroopers were spread across mountain peaks too far apart for mutual support, creating vulnerable positions that insurgents could isolate and overwhelm through concentrated attacks. On the night of January 7th to 8th, 1988, Mujahideen fighters, possibly including Pakistani Special Forces advisors, launched a massive assault on the 9th Company's position on Hill 3234, leading to intense close-quarters combat that Soviet survivors would remember as one of the war's most desperate battles. Paratrooper Yegor Tikhonko later recalled that machine gunners were essentially dead men, walking because whenever a machine gun opened fire, all the enemy's grenade launchers immediately directed their fire at it, and everyone tried to take it out first. Both of the company's machine gunners, Alexandrov and Melnikov, were killed during the fighting, as approximately 40 Soviet paratroopers held their position against several hundred attackers through the night, suffering heavy casualties but preventing Mujahideen forces from overrunning the hill. The 9th Company evacuated their position the next morning, but Mujahideen forces recaptured the road to Host within just 12 days, ending Soviet control and demonstrating that even the largest military operations could achieve only temporary tactical gains without producing strategic victory or political progress toward ending the war. The battle for Hill 3234 became iconic in Soviet and later Russian memory of the Afghanistan War, inspiring the 2005 film 9th Company that portrayed the desperate stand as representative of Soviet soldiers' courage and sacrifice in an unwinnable conflict. But the larger significance was that Operation Magistral, despite being the biggest and most resource-intensive Soviet operation of the entire war, had failed to achieve its strategic objectives, proving that military force alone could not break the stalemate when Mujahideen fighters enjoyed unlimited external support, safe havens in Pakistan, and support from Afghan populations who viewed Soviet forces as foreign occupiers, regardless of the economic development and modernization that Moscow claimed to offer. As Operation Magistral demonstrated the futility of continued military operations, the Soviet Politburo engaged in heated debates over Afghanistan's future, with members split between moderates led by Gorbachev, who wanted immediate withdrawal, and hardliners including KGB Chief Viktor Chebrikov and senior Politburo member Andrei Gromyko, who wanted to keep fighting or even expand the war into Pakistan to destroy Mujahideen sanctuaries and training camps. Armed Forces Chief of Staff Sergei Akrameyev provided a brutally honest assessment, admitting that Soviet forces controlled Kabul and provincial centers but could not establish authority in occupied territory, that they had lost the battle for Afghan hearts and minds, that the government was supported by only a minority of the population, and that the army could maintain the current stalemate, but that under such conditions, the war would continue indefinitely with no prospect of victory. In the end, the Politburo resolved to withdraw within 2 years, with Gorbachev pulling the plug because he wanted to focus on major domestic reforms, including glasnost and perestroika, that aimed to save the Soviet system through openness and restructuring. And because the cost of the war had exploded from 4.3 million rubles per day in 1984 to 14.7 million rubles per day in 1987, draining resources that the deteriorating Soviet economy desperately needed for modernization. But Gorbachev also felt increasing pressure from Soviet civil society, which could now express itself more openly under glasnost policies that allowed criticism of government actions, with returning veterans creating associations that criticized the lack of state care and channeled resentments about fighting an unwinnable war that served no clear Soviet interest. The influential Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, formed by concerned Soviet women, became a prominent critic of the army and the war, especially advocating for non-ethnic Russian soldiers who bore disproportionate casualties while popular artists like singer Victor Tsoi and his band Kino spoke for millions of young Soviets with anti-war songs that drew huge crowds and expressed widespread disillusionment. One Soviet veteran captured the confusion and resentment that many soldiers felt, describing how he had sincerely believed that a nomad's tent was worse than a 5-story apartment building, that without modern plumbing, there could be no culture, and that the Soviets were bringing civilization through tractors and brick houses, only to discover that Afghan peasants didn't want the land being given to them because it belonged to Allah, and that the smashed domes of destroyed mosques gazed at Soviet soldiers as if looking from outer space at an alien species that could never understand their world. On February 8, 1988, Gorbachev publicly announced that the USSR would withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, beginning diplomatic negotiations that led to the Geneva Accords signed in April 1988 by the Afghan and Pakistani governments, with the United States and Soviet Union acting as guarantors. The agreement proved impossible to enforce in practice because the Mujahideen were not involved in the talks and had no intention of ceasing attacks, with insurgent commanders insisting that the right to determine Afghanistan's future lay with those fighting in the trenches, rather than with exiled political leaders or foreign powers negotiating in Geneva. The Mujahideen believed they could win the war outright once Soviet troops departed, viewing Najibullah's communist government as a foreign puppet that would collapse without its Soviet protectors. Starting May 15, 1988, the first Soviet units began moving from peripheral outposts to main bases, with 50,000 troops withdrawing through 2 main routes over the following months. Soviet journalist David Guy described devastated villages along the roads where walls were overturned, houses smashed, trees twisted, fields bare, and irrigation systems turned to marshes, making his eyes burn with shame at the futility of 3,200 days of war. The Soviets left $1 billion in military equipment to Najibullah's regime, prompting the United States to restart aid to Mujahideen forces who launched major offensives. Between June and October 1988, insurgents captured numerous towns, though Afghan government forces proved resilient and recaptured some positions. In November 1988, approximately 2,000 Mujahideen under Abdul Rahim Wardak attacked bases east of Kabul, cutting off Jalalabad and killing hundreds of government and Soviet troops. On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge as the last Soviet officer to leave Afghanistan, ending 9 years of warfare that killed between 1.2 and 1.5 million Afghan civilians and left 1.5 million physically disabled, while 200,000 to 300,000 Mujahideen fighters died. 6 million Afghan refugees lived outside the country, while 2 million were internally displaced. For the Soviet Union, the defeat cost nearly 14,000 soldiers killed, 50,000 wounded, 6,700 permanently disabled, and 400,000 sick out of 620,000 who deployed. The military lost approximately 100 aircraft, 300 helicopters, 150 tanks, and Foreign Minister Shevardnadze estimated total costs at 60 billion rubles. The deteriorating Soviet economy could not afford. The Soviet Union lost the war in Afghanistan because the population mostly opposed the foreign occupation and the communist government, viewing both as violations of Islam and Afghan autonomy that no amount of modernization could make acceptable. The longer the war continued, the more Afghans joined the resistance, creating a situation where Soviet backing for communist reforms alienated the very people Moscow needed to win over. The more the Soviets helped their Afghan communist allies through secret police repression, the more Afghans opposed both the regime and its foreign protectors. The war cost enormous sums the Soviet economy could not sustain, with daily expenses tripling between 1984 and 1987, while total costs reached 60 billion rubles. The human cost made the war politically unjustifiable, as nearly 14,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, 50,000 wounded, and 6,700 permanently disabled. Neither the Soviet people nor budget makers would continue paying such costs for a war with no end in sight. No political solution existed because most Afghans rejected communist rule and foreign occupation. The Mujahideen benefited from unlimited external support, including Pakistani sanctuary through the ISI agency, American funding reaching $630 million annually by 1987, Saudi Arabia matching American contributions, and Chinese weapons, ensuring Soviet forces could never eliminate the insurgency militarily. The Stinger missiles that arrived in September 1986 neutralized Soviet air superiority, forcing pilots to fly too high for effective support. The Soviet Union lacked what was needed to win: Afghan political alliances to create legitimate government, political will to sustain indefinite warfare, and military capability to destroy an insurgency with safe havens and unlimited weapons. Armed Forces Chief Akramayev's assessment proved accurate that Soviet forces could maintain the stalemate, but that the war would continue indefinitely, making withdrawal the only rational choice. The Soviet defeat in Afghanistan accelerated the USSR's collapse by demonstrating fundamental weaknesses, including economic inability to sustain modern warfare and political inability to win popular support. Veterans returned home disillusioned, with many suffering from PTSD and hazing, while others turned to crime once the USSR collapsed. The war became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, proving that battlefield domination did not produce political victory when populations refused foreign rule. The defeat left Afghanistan devastated, with a state dependent on foreign aid, destroyed infrastructure, and bitter divisions. Najibullah's regime survived until 1992, when Mujahideen captured Kabul, but civil war eventually produced the Taliban, and conditions allowing al-Qaeda to launch the September 11, 2001 attacks. The Soviet experience proved that modern armies cannot overcome political realities when populations refuse foreign domination. Neighbors provide unlimited weapons to insurgents, and costs exceed what societies will tolerate. The 620,000 Soviet soldiers who served learned that military superiority means nothing without political legitimacy, and that some wars cannot be won when fundamental conditions make victory impossible. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.